I want to turn to our last session. I know we raised a lot of interesting questions and problems and the like in the last session, and maybe they'll slide into this one. But one of the sort of 800-pound gorilla in the Asian regional complex these days is, of course, the rise of China and what the implications of that are for developmentalism, for the developmental state, and for Japan, Korea, Taiwan in and of themselves in terms of their security policy, in terms of their economics. And I guess the fundamental issue is, to what extent does this have an impact on either their capacity to sustain developmentalism or their capacities to adjust to a new economic model, to new security challenges? All of those, I guess, are at least open questions. And I, without really checking with them in advance, put four folks down who I know have thought a little bit about this to at least get us started. In the interest of maximizing time for discussion, I'll ask people to sort of stay below the 10-minute max level if at all possible. Less is better. But Greg, do you want to get us started, please?
Less is better. Got it.
Okay.
Let me briefly describe a research project I'm involved in, which is to some extent very consistent with this conference, which is in a sense after developmentalism, or the extension of developmentalism, and then very briefly mention what we found about China and what we think the challenges for China are. The project is looking at automotive development in 7 East Asian and Southeast Asian countries in a world characterized by the WTO, global capital mobility, global value chains, and what Richard Baldwin has called globalization 2. So basically, the old approach that Japan and Korea took to the auto industry is no longer viable. And we're looking not so much at traditional instruments of the developmental state or of industrial policy such as protection and promotion, but supportive institutions for training, for standardization, for diffusion of technology, and for low-level technology development. And we basically outlined two possibilities, two possible paths that countries can take. They can try to focus on extensive development, increasing scale, and producing lots of things. And in particular, in this new globalization 2 world, that means basically accepting a relatively narrow part, labor-intensive part, of a global value chain. And the example of a success in that would be Thailand, which is now a major producer of automobiles, but which is not doing very much, doing almost none of the engineering or design or branding. These are all Japanese, mostly Japanese or Korean or European or American cars, designed, engineered, branded, figured out, managed elsewhere, but assembled and in Thailand with, to be fair, a little bit more Thailand, domestic content as production volumes have increased. So that's a success case. Philippines would be an example of a country that's tried to do the same thing, but without those supportive institutions has basically failed. In contrast to this extensive upgrading, we also look at intensive upgrading, where you try not simply to make more of a product developed and created elsewhere, but to increase the value added, increase the sophistication, or even create a new variant of the product. The classic example many years ago would be Japan and now Korea, which succeeded in both extensive and then later intensive development, but again, in a world in which they exercised complete protection and promotion. Professor Suzuki mentioned the Japanese auto industry, but there's a minor detail he left out, which is that it was completely protected for 30 years after the war. There were no imports in that whole period. So Toyota was not making decisions based on its ability to compete in the world. It was making its decision based on a local market which was absolutely protected well into the early 1980s. So in this new world, we compare Korea, which has done still very well, although much of it was done in the late 70s and the early 80s when the constraints of globalization 2 were not as severe, versus Malaysia, which has tried to look Northeast Asian, in some ways does, but has been hampered by this more open environment and also kind of a bit sui generis to Malaysia, the problems of ethnic balance and the sort of huge dilemmas that that's created for them. In this context, if we look at China, we see that if you look at the local press or the international press about the Chinese auto industry, you see vociferous criticism. It's a complete failure, 30 years of cooperation, Chinese can't do anything. The industrial policy, disaster, it's terrible, it's terrible, it's terrible, it's terrible. Everybody says it. Everybody's agreed, so I can stop right now. The only problem is, if you compare our 7 countries and ask what kinds of capabilities they've developed, can you brand a car? Well, yes, the Chinese can do that. Can you engineer a car? Well, yeah, the Chinese can do that. Can you design a car? Well, they didn't do that very well, but they're actually getting rather better at that. Can you develop new generation technologies? Well, they can do some of that too. Are you investing abroad? They're investing abroad. Are you selling a lot of parts in global markets? Yes, they are. Are you engaging in global mergers and acquisitions? Well, Geely bought Volvo, and everybody thought this was going to be a disaster. Geely would screw it up. Volvo was already failing. That's why it was on the market. And in fact, Volvo has now recorded record sales and is doing extremely well and becoming more integrated with Geely. So there's some real successes going on. Having said, and by the way, this is not just compared, Yuan Han said, you want to compare us to Southeast Asia? They're much poorer than we are. That's not fair. We're an upper middle income country. Which is true. I mean, that is, of course, true. But if we look at Brazil, whose per capita GDP is higher than that of China, or Turkey, which is also another rapidly rising country with a per capita GDP, I think, about the same as China, maybe even a little bit higher, there's a huge gap. Another interesting country which I've looked at very, very briefly is India, which in some ways looks kind of like China and has significant capabilities of its own. But overall, the level of industrial sophistication is much lower than in China. So the story we're telling for China is a rather more counterintuitive or counter-conventional wisdom kind of story. Yes, there are all kinds of problems, but there have been some, just measured by the criteria that we apply to other countries, China is clearly doing a lot of things fairly well. As I see it, and this brings me to the last part of it, the shorter part, China faces 3 tasks, and my version of what they are doing and what they're likely to be successful at is a little bit different from most people's. The first task is to dismantle bad institutions. So in our overall study, what we find is the successful countries like Taiwan and Korea and Japan have much more dense networks of institutions than the Southeast Asian countries, Singapore accepted. The trouble in China is actually, for such a poor country, it had a huge network of institutions. Unfortunately, they were socialist institutions, and they often did the exact wrong things. So step 1 is to get rid of what's not working, and that's a huge task which is by no means entirely finished. But I think compared to most people, I'm more sympathetic to Nick Lardy's argument that the government, although not giving up its support for state-owned enterprises, is allowing market dynamics to proceed in a way that's basically favorable to the private sector. The share of private firms in overall production keeps going up steadily, 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 steadily. So it's not that the Chinese government can make an active decision to take away support for state-owned enterprises. They're just letting things take their natural course, the result of which is the private sector is winning. So even though I do see this as a huge task, how to dismantle inappropriate institutions, I'm a little bit more optimistic than most people. I go with Lardy on this one. A second big task is to build new institutions that are more suitable for capitalism and for a more kind of a post-developmental state world, a post-global II world, a sustainable development world. Here, I think it's an ongoing task, it's a big task, but I'm actually not entirely pessimistic. Partly because in both the case of number 1 and number 2, it's actually in the interest of the government to do these things. And I am, as I always am, struck by the case of Taiwan before, where the share of state-owned enterprises in national production starting from the first time they measured it in 1952 to today looks like this. The KMT never decided we want to give up on state-owned enterprises. We want to give up on political control. Hell no. They never said that. But they let the market take its course, and that was what happened. And I think the CCP will face a lot of the same pressures, and it will come up to the same conclusion. We want performance, we want jobs, we want technology improvement, the private sector is delivering them, and I think they're going to really be wary of doing too much to stop what's already going on anyway. They won't give up support they won't pull the plug on the state-owned enterprises, but they'll continue to weaken. The third element, the last element, though, I think will be more of a challenge because it's not so much politically in the interest of the party, and that's to build connections with a mostly private business sector. So the desire, for example, to control all industry associations is still extremely strong. And the willingness to let private sector have active communication methods and to serve as a genuine representative of the industry is still very limited. And here I think the CCP's first, second, and third instinct is going to be control, control, control. And they may gradually learn and improve over time, but I think this one is one that's politically less amenable, less congenial to them, and I see it as a big challenge. Overall, though, I think we tend to look at China too statically. There are tremendous problems and huge failures, but there's also a lot of dynamism going on, and I'm not sure it's all bad, even though the current political environment doesn't look very good. There are underlying dynamics which continue despite Xi Jinping, thank God. Let me stop on that completely. Let me stop on that completely unbiased note.
Thanks very much.
I would talk about two issues. One is technology. Okay. Yeah. Technological learning in China is related to China rise, and the second is related to Taiwan's. Okay. I agree with Greg's argument that there are a lot of problems, but they make a lot of progress in terms of particularly semiconductor and IT industry. And maybe 10 years ago, people would think, okay, what China did is only assembly. But in these few years, it's progressed so rapidly, including very good components, and also because of the huge domestic market. Therefore, the company can organize the assembly line by themselves. For example, like a Xiaomi and those cell phone companies. And that has to be related to our contribution by Taiwanese component, small and medium enterprise investor, huge amount of money and units in Guangdong area and Shanghai area or Suzhou, and you know it was almost, I think it's in early 2003 or something, because of copycat cell phone industry, the rise of copycat cell phone industry. So the many small Chinese company began to assemble that kind of small components company, and then a lot of Chinese firms began to arise. So this is one of the big incident that China began to assemble their own company. And I think particular from 2008 and on, because of financial crisis, and China purposely organized their assembly line and the component, and became many of the famous company right now we know, for example, Tencent or Xiaomi, they began to organize by themselves, and right now become very, very famous, and also big firm. And many of the company like Alibaba also began emerge as a giant company and listed in New York stock market. And so during the process, we can see the rise of Chinese market, and Chinese market that is so enormous, so they can nurture those big company, and in turn, the big company can organize the production chain by themselves, which is very, very different from Korea and Taiwanese company, because Taiwanese company mainly based on export market rather than based on domestic market. But the Chinese market is so huge, so the originally very small company has the potentiality to organize the market and then become giant company in the world, and which is very, very different from Taiwanese case. And the implication for Taiwanese case, Taiwanese semiconductor industry and the IT industry is right now, it is almost began to be organized by Chinese firm. Before, Taiwanese firm was organized by Apple, by IBM, by Compaq, or HP. Right now, it's began to be organized by Chinese firm. So the production change has already been changed. Another big challenge for Taiwanese firm is, as Yunhan said, many of the firm has a huge lot of money, and so recruit the whole team, whole package of team talent from Taiwanese firm to their firms, and because right now those big company earn a lot of money, so he can use the pay to double or triple of a Taiwanese company, and then a lot of Taiwanese engineer move to China. It is a big challenge for Taiwanese IT industry. Right now, the winner, for example, like a TSMC is okay, but other companies are in dangerous, in risk. This is a situation of the technological learning. Chinese firm move very, very fast, and right they're the same. They recruit a lot of overseas Chinese back to China, and doing very advanced research and make a very advanced product right now. Okay, this is the first point I'm going to make. The second is I'm going to follow Yunha's arguments is because a lot of Taiwanese firms utilize the emergence of Chinese market. Therefore, the tendency is a lot of jobs moved out from Taiwan, and that occurred particularly last year because of the frustration of young people. It created a nurture that kind of atmosphere that a hatred of Taiwanese company to move to China, and also during the 4 decades of antagonistic relation, this also raised a kind of hatred of Chinese, or it's a kind of like a Taiwanese nationalism has been rising in Taiwan, particularly in young people, for the young people, and also because of the migration of job to China, so it creates jobless society and stagnation of wage labor, and also because a lot of Taiwanese businessmen earn lots of money in China, and then when they move back to Taiwan, then they put a lot of make their fortune in a real estate sector, and puts the rise of housing sector. So all those elements together make nurture a kind of atmosphere of anti-China, anti-Chinese sentiment, and particularly in these 2 years. And that create a problem for, on the one hand, it's good for people to think about alternative development. For example, like we don't want to have developmentalism. We may want to have community development. In Japanese, it's 小确幸. I don't know how to, small happiness. Small happiness. So this is built our community, and we build our small dam, we build our small community and our small farm. And although we don't want to have prosperity and to have linkage with China, we just want to have our small something. Okay, and that kind of sentiment become are very, very, I don't know how to say it. It's a kind of national movement for the young people. So on the one hand, it's good for thinking about alternative society, but on the one hand, where is the future of the Taiwanese economy? And we don't want to have the linkage too much with China. And but on the other hand, we want to have a small economy. But whether it is a kind of alternative for Taiwanese society is a thing that we need to find out. Another alternative is, DPP is going to take over state power next year. We anticipate that, and so they are begin to campaign southward transition. Okay, for example, because we invest too much in China, so next round, if we take over power, we want to promote southward investment. Right now, it began to nurture. So this is another alternative. But whether our Taiwanese businessmen want to go that way, it is another. Or India.
Yeah, they're promoting India.
Promoting India, but who knows? But anyway, those are the impact of the rise of China. Okay, thank you.
Of course. TJ said that the shorter the better, so I like to just keep my remark on probably 2 or 3 points. It is a very popular thing to do in Korean politics. There are 2 things that are really popular in domestic politics of South Korea. One is being anti-Japanese, for both the conservative and progressive, and the other thing is to be pro-Chinese for both ideological factions. For these reasons, one is that if you're conservative and critical of Japan, then it make you look patriotic, independent. If you're progressive, bashing Japan, then it is a good instrument to attack your conservative opponents. Many of them had ex-Japanese collaborator ancestors. What about pro-Chinese discourse? If you're conservative, then you must have a lot of business stakes in keeping business booming between South Korea and China. And if you're progressive, being pro-Chinese, will augment your image as a more sovereign, independent, and critical of the United States. But my point here is that all these noises and political discourses aside, there is a great deal of continuity and stability for South China coping with the rising influence of China in both security and economic front. And paradoxically speaking, the more China has become important to South Korea, and I assume to other two developmental states, Japan and Taiwan, the more the United States has become, the more important the United States also has become. So it's not a zero-sum dynamic for these three developmental states to choose between China and the United States. So this country seems to be very well aware of the danger of making a false choice between China and the United States. You know, people may say that, oh, I compromised my career ambition in order to have a better life with family, and vice versa. But that's not the right choice. The real right choice is to have them both right? So it's not so much about South Korea choosing China over the United States or U.S. over China, but to build a better relationship with both powers. And if you look into the public opinion surveys, then South Korean public is extremely conservative, sticking to the traditional perspectives on China and the United States. There are two images of China. One is about ancient China, with both fear and respect for the cult civilization. And the image of modern China, lots of fear as a potential military threat, but also economic competitor. And the interest doing business with China is critical for the future prosperity and safety of South Korea, but not much respect. So in terms of soft power, China is not likely to substitute for the United States in the future, at least in case of South Korea. What I foresee as a non-expert on economy is a kind of a competition and clash between two different courses of economic development. One is led by China, representative of a conventional developmental state model, growth, 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 and the state is at the center. But echoing, Ulrike and others, then it seems like the cluster of three developmental states, Taiwan, Japan, and South Korea, have been increasingly receptive to alternative growth. Economic discourse, which is not so much about growth or development per se, but it's more about quality of growth or happiness. And I personally witnessed this trend taking place, especially among young South Korean population, 20s and what. I used to see a lot of books on career development, focus on success, how to become a better presenter, how to persuade the other person in 15 minutes. It's all about success, success. Now, gradually, but explicitly, these books have been eliminated from the bookshop and replaced by books on happiness, genuine happiness, mindfulness. So there will be the growth of rising economic power of China may compel these two slightly more advanced Asian economies to move away from the prototypical developmental state system to something still in the context of developmental states, but different take, more focus on quality, small, local, environmentally friendly. So moving away. Another paradoxical possibility is rising economic power of China may push these Asian developmental states away, not close to, but away from China to move closer to the, American style of capitalism. The final point is that the rise of the international influence of China has helped South Korean public change their attitude toward the issue of peaceful unification with North Korea. The cross-strait relations and their negotiations on the potential unification in a peaceful manner has become a kind of a good example that South Koreans use to think of their own choices with regard to possible peaceful unification with North Korea. If Chinese and Taiwanese have been more or less successful in maintaining peaceful and productive relations without really sacrificing the aspiration of national unification, at least on the part of mainland China, then why don't we, stick to a similar formula? Why do we need to make too much sacrifices in hopes to, co-opting North Korea to discuss the peaceful unification as a legitimate partner? So the tendency in South Korean public, this will be my last point, is that we should wait until North Korea will show the clear sign that it is ready to be behaving like China, based upon prosperity and peaceful coexistence, at least for a while. We don't have to give North Korea any more special treatment or premium. This view is demonstrated in the public opinion survey as well. 3 out of every 4 young South Koreans in their 20s and 30s, yes, Koreans in their 30s should be considered young, are extremely worried about the personal cost of unification, even in peaceful manner, with North Korea. Why do we need to assume the personal cost for the political merger with North Korea, which is so dissimilar with South Korea in terms of political system, respect for human rights, the economic system, and whatnot? So South Korean public is increasingly inclined to the belief that we should wait until North Korea is more and more like at least China. Thank you.
Thanks very much. And finally, Joe.
Great. You want to use this? Okay, so I'm going to address my comments more squarely on the issue of China's rise and its implications with respect to the global economy and the regional economy. And it actually, let me begin by harkening back to a conference I participated in at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences in Beijing about 10 years ago. And I was talking to some colleagues there, Chinese colleagues, and I said, this was before the financial crisis of 08, 09. I said, could you imagine the global financial system recentering itself to Asia, right? So the World Bank, the major commercial banks being in New York and the city, the IMF. Can you imagine those actually being recentered in Asia? The Hong Kong Stock Exchange is on the rise, Singapore is the 4th largest, and so on. And they laughed at me. They said that would be impossible. Right. Well, I mean, fast forward 10 years and we're seeing this transformation happen right before our very eyes. So what TJ has touched on in terms of how he's described as the economic leadership of the region and, arguably even globally, has shifted to China. So the question that I want to sort of think about, and I'm going to offer some stylized observations, is, well, what exactly does that mean, right? What exactly do we have in store for us, and what can we learn from the previous regional global order and how that might shape how we think about this shift in economic leadership? So the first is to say that in the old system, you basically had the United States and the United States-Japanese alliance, but really it was about the United States being the consumer of last resort for the global economy, and that was really important. So if you think about Asia's rise in the post-war period, it was largely driven by American consumption. Now, this was, as TJ rightly points out, a pretty predictable, arguably rigid, but well-institutionalized system based on the Cold War alliances that the United States had configured in the Asia region, but more importantly because of the Bretton Woods systems and the Bretton Woods institutions, which allowed the United States to play this consumer of last resort. That was really, I think, the most important role that the U.S. played in fostering Asia's economic growth, alongside, of course, the security guarantees. We don't see that, I think, in China, right? So China, on one level, China's efforts to play a larger architectural role in the region is viewed, I think, still with suspicion. So whereas the United States was able to mitigate some of this suspicion, even though there were always leftists that, that would argue against this, was able to mitigate some of the suspicion through the Bretton Woods institutions and Cold War alliances. China actually hasn't been able to, I think, allay these suspicions quite to the same degree. So even if you look, for instance, at the AIIB, obviously Japan's not included, the United States is not included, Philippines is quite suspicious of this as it is embroiled in its own conflicts in the South China Seas. The Koreans aren't exactly 100% on board. There is still this lingering suspicion that things like the One Belt, One Road, AIIB, are a kind of Trojan horse, right? So whether that's empirically true or not is besides the point. It's the perception of that I think still undermines China's leadership role and makes it quite unlike what the United States, the role the United States played. And frankly, second of all, despite the promise of China's consumer market, which of course is incredibly enticing and promising, it hasn't been realized, right? I mean, as levels of inequality continue to rise in China, we know that China's consumer market isn't quite able yet to play the role that the American consumer market, as we now know, which was largely driven by credit, but that's another story, isn't quite ready to play the role of the consumer of last resort that the Americans played in the post-war period. So I think in that respect, the rise of China is quite distinctive, and the rise of China in terms of its leadership role, the regional economic leadership role that it plays, is very different than that of the United States. In terms of the regional economy, whereas, and I don't know if this room likes the idea of the flying goose model, and I'm simply just going to use it just for illustrative purposes. I make the argument that China is not the lead goose, and if China is the lead goose, then it's based on a completely different configuration. So if we look at the post-war period, Japanese economic leadership in this flying geese formation or configuration was based upon not scale. After all, Japan was never a large consumer market or destination, but rather based on Japan's economic sophistication and, frankly, its level of economic development. So if you look at FDI from out of Japan when it begins to accelerate this, its first accelerated push in the 70s and 80s were actually to less developed countries, which affirms this idea that it's moving sunset industries into late developing economies, places like Taiwan and Korea. The argument here being is that this really is a reflection of Japan's sophistication, not scale. To the extent that China plays a leadership role, and this is where I think we want to be very careful, is that China's leadership role is about scale and not sophistication, or at least not sophistication yet. There is the prospect that China, because of its large consumer market, may one day be the global standard setter, maybe, the fifth generation ICT networks, maybe in terms of pharmaceuticals, maybe in terms of alternative energy automobiles, but not yet, right? In fact, I really buy the argument that Doug Fuller makes. When you look actually at technology upgrading in China and you look and see which firms are actually doing the most, they're what he calls hybrid firms, which are basically firms that are foreign invested into China. And the reason why they're much more technologically productive is because they actually have the discipline of foreign finance, right? So you don't have the soft budget problems, you don't have procurement problems, you actually have market fitness firms. These are not Chinese firms. These are firms like Winbond, Inventec, Honghai, and things like that, right? So China's leadership role, I think, at the moment is scale, not sophistication. Again, if you look at its FDI patterns, it's very unlike Japan, right? Whereas its FDI was essentially growing the region's economic sophistication. You look at largely outbound FDI from China, the lion's share of it is going to the Middle East, North Africa, and Sub-Saharan Africa, largely driven by energy concerns, and Latin America. And actually FDI towards the rest of Asia is about 15%. So that's very unlike the Japanese leadership. So I just raise these, and I say they're stylized observations. It's not an area that I have, tremendous expertise, but this kind of leadership is very different from Japan's economic leadership. And so when we talk about handing over the reins of economic leadership to China, I think it's well worth it to actually interrogate what this means, because it certainly isn't going to be post-war Asia redo. It's certainly not going to be Japanese economic leadership redo. And I think it's actually quite fundamentally different.
Very good. Very good. Thanks. I think this works. Very good. Thanks.
I got it.
Press 3 times. Okay.
3 times.
Let me see if I can engage a point that I think is either at odds or at least deserves some further commentary between Joe and Greg on the issue of what happens next. I mean, Joe basically says very limited soft power, very limited appeal to the rest of the neighborhood, et cetera, by China, whereas Greg is largely focused on the ways in which China's auto industry has the capacity to really become globally competitive, maybe some glitches along the way. But I guess the kind of point I would just be interested in hearing you both address is the question of whether soft power, the appeal of soft power comes after the demonstration of economic muscularity. In effect, one of the ways in which Japan managed to win over the global auto market was they finally began to produce really good cars. And, little by little, American consumers who might have been predisposed to say, ain't going to buy any of those, cars by the guys that fought us in World War II, suddenly they're buying Toyota pickups because they're better cars. So I guess what I'm really addressing is that question of moving this out 20 years or so. I guess to Joe, the question is, would you anticipate that the rest of the region moves in ways that begin to reflect a greater acceptance of some version of Chinese leadership as opposed to the worrisome picture that Yong-shik suggests exists in Korea? And I guess the flip side for Greg is whether this is all economically driven and or whether there is really an element in which this translates into other appeals for China beyond just we can make cars and sell them to a lot of Chinese.
Just very quickly, I mean, I think the challenge for China is that it is, as you say, it's the 800-pound gorilla, the 800-ton gorilla, whatever it might be. I mean, it really is, it's the scale that is, I think that is both unique about China, it's its comparative advantage, and it's also potentially frightening for its neighbors. I mean, with respect to the auto sector, I don't know, I mean, I defer to Greg on this, but if I were a betting person, it would seem to me that whereas the Japanese auto sector and later the Korean auto sector really solidifies Japan's global economic presence was because of its ability to export. And that's really where we see the growth of the auto sector in Japan. Whereas I could imagine that the Chinese auto sector could be very successful without ever having to export. And again, I don't know what that means, but that's very different from Japan, right? And that's a different kind of economic dominance, as they say. And I say this totally flippantly, and without any. Without having looked at the books or anything like that our B school colleagues would, it would not surprise me if China were to become a leader in alternative energy cars for its by virtue of growing on the back of its domestic market. I mean, that's just that's just thinking 20 years out. I mean, I don't have any basis upon which to make that argument, but it would seem to me that it could grow an auto sector without having to export, unlike Japan. But I don't know if that's, you could tell me I'm totally wrong.
I think we agree more than we disagree, actually, although we're emphasizing slightly different things. I think, like Professor Wang, I think that the level of dynamism in China is seriously underestimated. I know Greg Fuller is a big a skeptic about China. I'm marginally more optimistic than he is. But I think that there are two somewhat contradictory things going on. At least they appear a bit contradictory. I think the reality is that China is changing very quickly and will establish leadership in some areas. But if we link it to what TJ is particularly interested in, which is how foreigners perceive it and take it, I think there are some very big obstacles. If we look particularly at the auto industry, but others as well, first is quality. The first Chinese cars that went abroad were terrible. And you can still find YouTube videos of them crashing into little clumps. The fact is the Chinese firms reacted very quickly. The cars, within a year, they were passing those same tests, but nobody gets a YouTube video of a Chinese car passing a quality test. The first impressions matter in romance and in automobiles, too. And they really ruined the first impression. The second one is lead users. Japan was relatively not rich, but middle income to middle upper income, and it had a lot of good lead users, and the products were more sophisticated, higher quality. China is, as we always say, big and diverse. So there actually are some lead users in China, but the reality is that most Chinese are still poor, and foreigners think they're even poorer than they are. And so I think the impression that Chinese products, by definition, must be backward and ill-suited to sophisticated markets is still there. That may not stop China from doing well in Africa and Latin America. And in fact, I think Chinese manufactured goods will do well because they're not all crap. It's not true. But if you're talking about more sophisticated economies, I think it's going to take a long time. I think reality, a little bit like Japan, only more so. It's going to be like Japan. The cars were actually pretty good. We didn't believe it. But within 5 years, we believed it. It'll take 15 years in the case of China. The last thing I'd say, of course, is there's the CCP. Japan, you can say what you will about the LDP, but it was essentially a democratic country, and it wasn't a military threat. China is. And I think when you add these together, perceptions, not all fair and often too static, but not entirely unreasonable either, about questions about quality and safety and honesty, plus the relative lack of lead users, the relative lack of sophistication of the average Chinese, plus the fact that it's coming from a country that's authoritarian and potentially a threat, will mean that even if China were better at soft power, even if the CCP, which is laughably bad at it, were good at it, it would be hard. So I think in that sense, what we're saying is what I'm saying is in 20 years, I think what you'll find is when the transformation comes, people will be kind of overwhelmed by how much more dynamic and powerful China is than they thought. But it'll still take 20 years. There, I think we agree. One other thing I would say that's worth mentioning, and you can put I take a slightly different view of this than Doug, although Doug and I have talked and I agree with a lot of what he says, and that is that a fundamental difference between Chinese development today and the development of particularly Japan and Korea before globalization 2 of the mid-1980s is that inward DFI is much higher. Into China. And that's a fundamental difference. And Doug looks at this as weakness. Chinese can't do crap on their own. They're all relying on the foreigners. But if you look at the auto industry in particular, which is not quite as technically demanding as electronics and for various reasons, and if you look more generally, I'm not quite as pessimistic. And companies like Daimler and GM and even the Japanese companies are setting up bigger and bigger research institutes in China. And eventually that is going to start shaking the whole world. But not yet. And when it happens, it's not going to be Chinese power unbridled. It's going to be China dominating or at least being a major player in multinational networks going beyond the network state, beyond the individual nation state. But again, it's going to take time. And so my prediction is this. Every year, people are going to say China's not nearly as big and fancy as they say it is. No, no, no. People often say, oh, the business press is so fawns on China. That's not true. Read the New York Times. Every article is about how bad China is. It looks good, but it's actually bad. The reality is actually bad. Especially the New York Times, which is a supposedly liberal newspaper. They're very anti-Chinese. So my prediction is for 20 years, we're going to hear about don't believe China is actually improving. It's still terrible. It's still terrible. Still terrible. Still terrible. Until one day you go, my God.
I have a Chinese car.
I have a Chinese car.
Thank you. I oftentimes compare social scientists, especially China experts, to 7 blind men trying to measure up the biggest elephant in the room. Each one come up with a different assessment. We have to remember China is so complex and huge and diverse. So you can say anything about China cannot be completely right, but cannot be completely wrong either. So we oftentimes overgeneralize, about the story of China. I oftentimes remind our colleagues that China is aggregate of at least 5 components. It's a small universe in and by itself. You have China, the most shining part is a world-class megacity and high-tech hub, like Beijing, Shanghai, Shenzhen. And in many ways, this megacity has already overtaken Taipei. Also, in many ways, okay, and sophistication is very high of certain emerging company, like Huawei can rival Oracle, Qualcomm in any product line. Tencent can rival, the Line or Facebook, and Alibaba can rival Amazon. So that's also China, okay. But at the same time, then the vast coastal region, which I would say is a very strong competitor of South Korea, Taiwan as a whole. Okay, so we are competing with our clone of the past. Not many years ago, okay, maybe 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 15 years ago. And then the middle part of China, which I would say can easily outcompete Thailand or Malaysia, there's higher income, the middle income, ASEAN. And the western part of China, not the far west, just western part, like Chongqing, place like that, they can easily, outcompete Indonesia, the Philippines, the lower middle income ASEAN. And then the far west is like the Central Asia, in many ways in terms of ecology, population. So this is China. It poses so many, the challenge to its neighbor is really multifaceted. It's, in every way, in every fundamental way. So for Taiwan, I think for South Korea as well, we have been overwhelmed by the implication and impact brought about by China, especially over the last 20 years. China offered our company, especially export-oriented company, an easy exit. Not only an easy exit, but also an opportunity to become a real world-class player. To grow faster, much faster, than it was conceivable possible at all. So that's why Foxconn, right? From little nowhere to become the 31st largest company in the world within 20 years. And those companies, I have to admit that for them, if they don't feel Taiwan as very hospitable, okay, they can easily, pack and go. But they cannot have the same option, when it comes to China. Honghai, its new assembly line in Zhengzhou, which turned out 50 million iPhone 6 within 6 months, is simply not replaceable. And for Apple, it's also not replaceable. Irreplaceable. No, okay. It's so this is and all the richest people on Taiwan, where they make their fortune, unfortunately, in China. Like Honghai, also known as Foxconn, and people who produce instant noodle and cracker, the three richest people. Okay, so we are dealing with not only footloose, big capital, but now they also footloose professional. Zheng Huan talking about the younger generation in Taiwan, they embrace the so-called petit or small, secure happiness, right? But actually, there are two orientations among our younger generation: the vocal one and the silent. The silent one, they are busy preparing themselves for career anywhere, getting one more certificate, one more license, one more foreign language. Okay. So, if we cannot offer them a very, promising career path in Taiwan, they will simply go elsewhere. So this is, the challenge. And then every local government, provincial city in China, they can put up some package, okay, to do our investment, okay. Now they also offer the very lucrative compensation package for our talent, okay. Now, and there's no way that, so our government, in a way, is kind of the way why it's become so powerless and helpless, there's no way they can match, those package. And then that also build up the ego and empower their bargaining power of our big business. They say, Shenzhen government give me this, what you can offer, in terms of land, in terms of, this tax incentive, holiday, everything. So I don't have the answer, but I only describe this big elephant. It poses such a challenge, so big and so overwhelming. It's very difficult for Taiwan as a society or or the government, really to cope with in a very effective way. Yeah.
But just a second, Joe. But I mean, a point that I would sort of underscore on this is that I think in some respects this is a problem for all three countries. Mm-hmm. In the sense,
exactly,
that China becomes a very attractive option for certain companies.
Yeah.
I'm not sure yet in Korea or Japan it's as attractive an employment opportunity for the young, but more fundamentally, I think all three countries, to the extent that they cannot offer positive lifestyle choices for their young people, face the real threat of losing those young people either to other countries. I mean, I think American professors are always stunned by the number of young Japanese women who get an MA, go back to Japan, and they're asked to pour tea for 5 years, and they say the hell with that, and they come back to the U.S. and relocate. But I think all three governments have to be thinking about that question of how do we provide attractive alternatives to keep our talented young people here? But Joe,
Well, I mean, everything that Johan said is exactly was exactly the point I was trying to get across. Is that everything that Johan said to describe that elephant in this room is exactly not what Japan was. So when we talk what Japan was and what it represented and its leadership role in the region, I mean, Taiwanese firms never had to worry about their manufacturers and their sources of employment fleeing to Japan, right? So the point is that as we think about, as you say, TJ, the handing over of regional economic leadership from Japan to China, it's not just simply redo. What we have are a whole host of new challenges. I mean, I put forward the argument that challenges stem from China's scale. That's probably much too simplified, but I think it's part of it. But it's vastly different than what the region had experienced before. So that's why, in that respect, TJ, I think that your paper, in talking about the end of the rigid bipolarity, the dismantling or the sort of the retreat from the Bretton Woods institutions and the predictability of American hegemony in the region as exercised through Japan, is a fantastic intervention. It's a fantastic way of thinking about an exogenous shock, but we're so far from answering that question, right? First, my point is to acknowledge that it's not post-war Japan redo. It's just not at all similar.
Yeah. Lowell? And I'm not sure we're going to get a mic on you, but I think we can all hear you. But
I just wanted to throw out a question. What do you think the future of incoming FDI is? Here we go. What do you think the future of incoming FDI is for China? 10 years ago, it was half of China's exports. FDI, foreign invested firms, were about half of China's exports. That shrunk to about 30%, something around 30%. And there is some have the impression that China's trying to squeeze out the foreign invested sector to favor its own industries. And I just read something from the European Chamber of Commerce, VUTKA, He said China's reform and closing up. That's probably an overstatement, and he has a particular interest. So I just wanted to ask that question. What is the future of FDI, incoming FDI in China?
Does anybody?
Could I piggyback on that?
Sure, go ahead.
I just add another question to the first question. That was actually one of the things on my list to say, and that is, I'm having a interesting ongoing conversation with Barry Norton, who some of you know as a China economist. And the conversation is about, were we wrong in, I got this, were we wrong in thinking that insulation, or what TJ in his paper calls the greenhouse thing, was a necessary condition for fast economic growth or the developmental state or something? Because in the model that, I actually don't know what the original model is. Was it Shell that kind of, well, he came up with a word, but anyway, there was always this idea that we would have to close the country up and sort of do the infant industry stuff, and then we grow really fast, and then eventually, when we're rich and wealthy, we'll let maybe 5% of sales or so can be imported goods, and China has turned that upside down, and so the first question is it not a necessary condition to close the country up, or maybe it is, and China grew regardless. And then the follow-up on this is that a destabilizing thing or not? Right. So it's a different way of asking the same question. I mean, it says, what do you get in a sort of when you dismantle a development model that did not have the greenhouse as a pillar of its structure?
Can I comment on the FDI? Well, yeah. First of all, what will happen next? It's the following. Number one, that China last year invest more overseas than they taking FDI. They become a net capital export exporting country, and that trend will continue. Okay, you will see more Chinese money, go after technology, market access, not to mention natural resources everywhere in the world. Okay, that's number one. Number two, I think China will accelerate and deepen its import substitution, industrialization. So it will make more and more, domestic supplier to replace the foreign import, which will come out very naturally. But obviously, that will actually, to some extent, if you rely on the conventional statistics of international trade, that might dampen the growth rate of world trade, which is happening already. For the last 25 years, the growth of the world trade is faster than the global GDP, but you probably will see a reverse trend happening because China, deepen, accelerate import substitution, and it will impose its own rule, regulation. In every major domain, including especially internet. So any foreign company who want to play a substantial role in China's market, either you have to form a joint venture with enough local equity participation, and or following the local rule. Regardless, you're talking about Google or Facebook, any other company. Okay, so this is another bipolarity. The U.S. led, dominated, writing the rule, but Sino-centric, domain. Okay, they will also create a new rule. But on the other hand, the traction is so big, and no global company can miss, or pass up the opportunity. So that's why when Uber, want to make a big march in China, they have to create a new company in Shanghai Free Trade Zone, separate, from its headquarters here, and try to make that, like a, kind of a Uber China, it's located in China, following the Chinese, regulation and the wishes of the regulator. I think that probably will be the trend. Okay, yeah.
Sunil Kaha and then Greg.
I agree that scale is really the compelling aspect of China as of now. But I also agree that China is an extremely, because of the scale, extremely diverse country, diverse economy. It's got some of the poorest communities in the world, practically next door to some of the most prosperous communities and classes of people, which of course is an anathema to socialist ideology of the ruling government. But the fact that China is such a diverse society, diverse economy, tells us that China can sustain its development even if it were almost totally excluded from the rest of the world. China is a world unto itself. Of course, so far, they've had to depend on investment of capital and technology into China because they were lacking, and they had to compete against other countries that were doing very well, including Taiwan, South Korea, and Japan. Eventually, I think what you're suggesting is going to take place. That is, internally driven production and internally driven consumption.
In the past.
Yeah, internally
dependence of the United States had become lower when it became a much gigantic economy. Sorry, just add a footnote to what you said. Yeah.
Sure. And the diversity of China is an extreme advantage that China enjoys that very few other countries do, including the three countries that we're talking about here. You have to remember that China has outcompeted Japan in selling the bullet train into some foreign markets. If they keep on doing that, they're going to be extremely competitive on some sectors of industry, manufacturing, while at the same time they're going to be running textile manufacturing and really labor-intensive manufacturing, which China does need to sustain just to provide enough job opportunities for the Chinese people. So China simply is not comparable to Taiwan, South Korea, or Japan. So the big question is, given the diversity of China, what kind of concerted, uniform, standard voice or attraction can China project to the rest of the world? If a country is so diverse, which part of China are we going to emulate if we need to as a model? Which parts of China are we going to ignore, or can we afford to ignore other parts of China that are not very attractive? Right now, many municipalities in Japan and South Korea have depended heavily, and the officials stated this, on the tourists coming from China. When local economies are really depressed in Japan, they need the Chinese tourists come, spending millions of dollars altogether within a matter of a few months. Japanese can't do that. They didn't do that even at the height of their consuming fever. Chinese can afford to do that because of the sheer number. So already, Chinese influence, at least the economic influence, is being felt globally. And if the Chinese consumer power continues to increase, even 1/10 of the Chinese were able to afford to go around the world. It's a huge, huge asset for the rest of the world. So is that the part of China that we're going to embrace and welcome more of, appreciate? Or are we going to, in other words, the basic question is how we balance our view between those assets that China shares with us and those negative assets that China may want to share with us, including environmental problems, including socialist orientation, including human rights violations. How do we deal with a country that is full of contradictions, if you will?
Very carefully.
Sobering.
Greg?
I wanted to make two slightly technical points, which I think have big implications for both DFI and consumption. On the DFI side, there are some technical questions about how you measure DFI, and I won't go into the details, but the bottom line is DFI seems to grow very rapidly, and it almost always tails off. People say, oh, this country has lost attractiveness, but that's misleading. What often happens is a company takes foreign capital to set up the local subsidiary, and then it starts borrowing from local banks. As it becomes established, it doesn't need to borrow, so you don't see it when you just look at the capital. A better measure is employment or assets control, but those measures are a lot harder to come by. So we normally see purely financial measures, and they're really, really misleading. I can write you the headlines already. Foreigners depart China, and it will be partly true and mostly misleading. It'll mostly be because we don't see it. In addition, in the Chinese case, there were big incentives for foreign exchange. So you not only had people from Taiwan and Korea going in because of the incentives, but you also had Chinese doing the round-trip investment. So that inflated the apparent DFI numbers because some of it was Chinese money. Those incentives have largely been eliminated now, and that's another reason why it seems like it's going down. So I think my prediction is this. It's going to look like foreigners are abandoning China, and that will be wrong. It will be very misleading. The second one on the consumption side also I think it's worth thinking a little just briefly technically about the numbers. China did most, okay, we think of export-intensive countries as having surpluses, but those two do not necessarily go together. As Professor Peng knows, or wherever he is, Jung-Min, if he's still here, Korea chronically ran deficits, and it's understandable. They had high savings rates, but even higher investment rates, and the level of import substitution was not that high. They depended on imports of foreign machinery. That was even true of Japan before 1968 or 69 or so. In China's case, yes, they run huge surpluses today, but if you put it on a chart, they didn't run big surpluses till the early 2000s. They peaked at 10% of GDP, which is very high for such a big economy to be true. It's back down to less than 3% now. And we have good reason to think that that's going to continue. Why? Because consumption is going up faster than GDP now, and that will continue. And the country is aging, and aging societies start saving less, and you don't have as much excess capital. So I think the assumption that China is not going to be a great engine of development because it's not going to be a consumption is, again, it's like everything I think with you. I kind of agree with you for the short to medium term, but this is a gigantic train, man. If it's an elephant, if it's a train, whatever it is, it's big. And it's got a lot of momentum. And as Chinese society gets richer and older, it's going to save less and import more, and it's going to become a huge importer.
And a market of last resort?
Maybe. Of course, don't forget that was linked to finance. The U.S., when you had the Bretton Woods system, Japan, Europe needed dollars to trade. So it's easy to say the U.S. was undisciplined. American deficits were a problem of American politics. But it was also a structural necessity to make the world economy grow. It was dependent on the dollar. Right now, China does not need to supply foreigners with renminbi to trade with China. That could change, but not yet.
That's a good point.
I wonder if I can raise one other dimension of this, which occurs to me, and it links the economic and security questions, and that is that China, several people pointed out, I think Yongshik most explicitly drew a line under it, but the question is that for many in Asia, China poses a mixed image. I mean, on the one hand, there's that attractive economy. We can either buy their stuff cheaply, or we can invest there, or we can sell there. 1.2 billion people buying our toothbrushes or electric shavers or whatever, versus the security implications, which certainly in the case of Japan have been acute in the last couple of years, probably least acute in the case of Korea. But I mean, we did get that rewriting of Chinese history that suggested you were all part of China in the long run. And if you want to sort of project out, that's not a particularly attractive way to think about it. And certainly Taiwan has continually had to face that dilemma. So I wonder whether people have any sense. Well, and let me just add one last point on this. I mean, one of the interesting things as I follow Japan is the fact that despite the negative security relationships between Japan and China, the use of, hard-edged diplomacy and moving ships around the Senkaku and so forth and so on, the reality is that behind the scenes, there's a resurgence of Japanese investment in China. The economic cooperation seems to be getting some injection of revitalization. Both sides seem to be, in effect, saying, yes, we've got these diplomatic or security problems, but can we put them back on the shelf because there's a positive economic agenda that would allow both of us to move forward. So I guess the broad question is how do you folks see the economics and security tensions playing off with regard to China? I mean, we know the answer from the business school that the market will drive this. Politicians will fall in line, which may be true, and we certainly see evidence of that. But I don't know, Young-Sik, do you have any thoughts from the Korean side? Maybe?
I'd like to start with what you said, that the market drives politics and security politics. That's correct up to a certain level, because if anything, that the growing economic interdependence between China and other countries will make a stabilizing effect on the security and diplomatic front. Having said that, you raised this point. The identity of China in the eyes of neighboring countries doing business with China seems to be the central concern. You never know. You never know how China will turn out. Because I've been thinking in my head while listening to your very thoughtful debate on leadership of China, but I'm not sure whether we should still make a clear distinction between China being influential and China being exercising leadership or hegemony. Because China's power comes from its ability to withdraw, not provide visions or plans or systems. So unless China clearly has attained the capability in the economic realm, then the image of China will remain more or the same, with a great deal of uncertainties and suspicions that will continuously and negatively affect the way that these three developmental states see the potential linkage between security and economic development in their diplomatic context with China.
Yes, I say it's right now in Taiwan. I think China does not have very good image in Taiwanese society, and at the current stage, the identity of being Chinese is reducing to a very, very low level, as the Taiwanese is a very high level. But one of the recent poll is very interesting. Over 50% of the population of the sample are thinking that be unified by China is a possibility. So I think this is very controversial, and but the economic dependence of Taiwan to China right now create a situation because Taiwan begin to lose its own confidence on economic prosperity. It depends very much on China. And China's leverage on economic resources and political manipulation on the triangle relation, China, Taiwan, and United States, seems to be in a way that toward its goal. But it's very complicated. I think everybody knows that. But if this poll done 2 years ago, I don't think that would be over 50%. But at current stage, is a new phenomena, and that may be pay attention to. Yes.
Maybe representing Japan, the other country in question. Well, the question you put is related to a capitalist peace question. There are maybe 2 or 3 hypotheses. One is Japan is deepening its economic relationship with China out of this economic malaise, since Japanese economy has been going through a long recession. China is an only opportunity through which Japan can improve its economic conditions. The second hypothesis is that Japan is rationally calculating, hoping that the better economic relationship will improve its political diplomatic relationship. The number 3 is it's a negative side of the capitalist piece, that if we deepen the economic relationship with China, China will further strengthen its economic might and spending a lot of money on military. I don't have good answer to the 3 hypotheses, which one is right or wrong. Well, we have just a hope that China will become more peaceful, as one said earlier. That where China will go in future, and 10 years later, or 20 years later, it's in a great uncertainty. So under this great uncertainty, we have to operate and rationally calculating our relationship with China in political and economic and military terms. So the best we can do is to make our relationship multifaceted. It's important to exchange security information with the Chinese counterparts, and at the same time, we continuously improve our economic relationship. Again, it's hoping China will change its attitude.
For century, most of European countries had to cope with the rise of Germany. So there's a word of the German problem. One of your longtime colleague, Peter Katzenstein, wrote a book on this issue and how to harness and restrain German power. And eventually, you might argue that the post-war, the common market, and then the European Union is one of the most sophisticated multilateral arrangement that try to harness Germany. I think, although obviously China is much bigger than Germany, proportional to the rest of Asia, but nevertheless, I think engage China through all kind of multilateral mechanism. Probably that's the only way to go. Okay, to on the one hand, to maximize the positive or the better part of the asset, right? We want to share with China, and at the same time to minimize the negative externality. Actually, Taiwan, obviously, that option might not be our choice, because China usually preclude Taiwan from participating in those multilateral arrangements. But our society actually engaged in China in a very, very extensive and multifaceted way. People probably, some people recognize that, some people don't. for instance, that we have about 500,000 Taiwanese working in China full time, and another 500,000 part time, substantially part time. The movement of capital, information, and human being is so torrential, in terms of volume and intensity. And our NGO, including our religious group, is a very, very powerful agent of change, transforming China in a way usually not recognized by the Western media. So I'm not entirely pessimistic, even though my earlier remark might leave you with that impression. Give you just one instance that there's a law professor, his name is Wang Zejian. He's an expert on many of the civic code, his textbook is the most read law school textbook in China, period. So his work and many his colleagues' work has, in a very, very fundamental way, shape how those new law and regulation come out of the National People's Congress in China, indirectly, but nevertheless those intellectual input. So I guess anyway, I think engagement, multilateralism, that's probably the answer. How we might harness and restrain and transform China.
So I'd love to just hear the reaction of colleagues about this recent New York Times article, the great anti-China newspaper, about it was on the occasion of Modi's visit, and talking about how a lot of the high-tech titans in Silicon Valley were saying that they were more inclined to be moving some of their foreign investments into India as opposed to China, and citing some of the very things that TJ has alluded to, the sort of the elements of soft power, right? I mean, India doesn't have the hardware capability that China has, and so in many respects it doesn't make much sense. But things like, censorship, things like legal system and so on, anyway, that's what it was. That was the thesis of the article. I don't know. I have no idea how to evaluate the legitimacy of those claims, or if this is just the New York Times rabble-rousing.
I'll take a stab at that. It's kind of reinforcing what Greg said, only saying a little differently. So when we look at FDI, we want to look at stock and flow, right? And so the flow will always go where labor costs are cheapest. So if you look at the entire world and you look at FDI data, you'll see that the growth and year-on-year FDI into a certain location, is driven by labor costs, and people go there and they open a plant to assemble something. And so you would almost expect this. Right, because the stock in China is so high. This is exactly what you said. That if you look at the year-on-year thing, then it has to go down at some point, because otherwise, not 100% of China would be owned by foreign companies, which is not going to happen, right? In the capital. So I think that's almost logical that China would see faster growth rate in the flow, but then the stock, India, and then the stock in India is much lower. So you don't have to even interview anybody. I mean, that's what the economists would predict.
But I guess I'd add a second point, and that is that it does seem to me that one of the dilemmas for potential investors in China is the one that's been laid out, and that is, how much are we willing to accept censorship, real restrictions on what we do, et cetera, particularly in the IT area, but how much are we willing to, allow our biotechs or farmers to move in here and then be subject to instant competition from generics developed by China, et cetera, et cetera? Can we trust China to behave, quote, responsibly? But then the flip side with India is, the advantage of China in many ways is that there is an infrastructure. India there are some fundamental problems with infrastructure, and if you wanted to get your stuff to market, it'd be a lot easier to do it from Shanghai than it would be from Delhi, probably. But whoops, we generated a rapid escalation of responses. Youngshik, and then
one sentence. What I think has been missing in our discussion on China is if there's any genuine possibility for other countries to help shape the future of China's behavior, or is it out of bounds? Only the United States can do it, and other countries will just throw hands in the air and just wait and see what happens.
Isn't part of the answer to that, though, the economic strength and other resources of neighboring countries? I mean, an economically strong
if China's influence comes from its size, then you can't compete with China or try to influence China's behavior in any significant way. It's
sad about the biotech, though. In that research that I've done, when interviewing these regional CEOs, 10 years ago, they were moving their R&D centers to places like Taiwan, Korea, and Singapore, citing precisely the rule of law in the inability at the corporate level to trust China.
Yeah.
10 years later, I was interviewing the same regional CEOs, CSOs, and so on. They were moving them to China because they had built in the risk into their business model and were enticed. Well, it's a, I mean, that's possible. They build it in terms of IP theft and whatnot, but the scale of China's R&D establishment was just too enticing when they needed to diversify their bets as broadly as possible.
So not necessarily the trust levels have gone up.
Trust has not gone up, but it just was the scale, opportunities. As they said,
the risk-return calculation.
Yeah, that's right. Absolutely.
Greg, Carl, and then Johan, and then I'll call it quits.
Geography still matters. There was a really great Nikkei Business cover story on India one time, and they had a cover on called the Bengal Barrier. And the emotional feeling and the business calculations, we would love to have more business with India. They're not authoritarian. They speak English. They're not Chinese. They're not threatening us. It would be great. And yet when the author, this reporter, actually went to India and saw the conditions, he went through this long list and sort of, zannen nagara, unfortunately, the first thing is India is a long ways away. I can go from Tokyo to San Francisco and it's a pain in the rear and you get jet lag, but you can do it. Going to India from San Francisco is a seriously big deal. And the same thing is true from Japan. This is 5 years ago, so it's out of date. But there were 240 Pacific flights, direct flights from Japan to China at the time, and there were 3 weekly, I think, direct flights to India. It's a big deal to go to India. And then he went down the list. Yes, the Indians speak really good English, but when we go to Southeast Asia or China, we all speak lousy English and it's kind of comfortable. And they respect us and they like us. And we all sing karaoke together and we eat the same kind of food and it's all kind of comfortable. And we're in the hardware business and we're better at hardware than they are and they look up to us. We go to India, can't eat the food, can't drink the water. The expatriate housing is unbelievably expensive. And then we talk about software, which they're better at than we are, and they're so aggressive. And so I think India has some huge advantages. Nobody's mentioned English. English is a huge advantage a gigantic advantage for India, plus the rule of law, plus the fact that it's not a military competitor. But it's a long ways away. And I'll just add one more on India. If you look at these statistics on malnourishment, there's a lot of talk about how India is going to have a demographic advantage over China. Give me a break. Who will these young people growing up in India when it surpasses China in population going to be? They come from northern India, they're peasant children, and they're malnourished. They're not even going to reach full IQs. India will be extremely strong in some areas. In some areas, corporate governance is already much better than in China. Go to a website. Go to a big Chinese company and a big Indian site. Tell me who's got a better website. There's no comparison. The Chinese are so secretive and so crappy at this stuff. The Indians look global. They have huge advantages in some areas. And, of course, they're more Microsoft is led by an Indian, not by a Chinese. And those kinds of examples, I think, will be multiplied. So I think India is going to be much more it's going to be much more circumscribed. In some areas, incredibly strong. But when you look at the big numbers and the big picture and the GDP and the overall FDI, I don't see India threatening China in the foreseeable future.
neighborhood effect.
Just a quick point, I was just going to underline Joe's point about foreign firms feeling like they have to be in China, even though trust levels haven't gone up, by repeating one of Yongshik's points, which was one of the most important things I've learned in this session, and that is that China's power comes from its ability to withdraw, not to provide. And so it's not going to be a lead goose. And I don't know if we call it a condor or a bull or something else, but it's not going to recreate that model.
Yeah. Yonhan?
Well, China is the panda with two wings,
Yeah.
Anyway, China obviously is one of very few developing countries that can impose terms on multinational. It's not entirely a bad thing. Okay, although there's certain demand which probably violate our core value. But at the same time, I want to hasten to point out that what's good for General Motors is not necessarily good for the United States, or especially the general public. So some of the complaint of multinational not entirely 100% justifiable. Like the patent over drug, right? Things like that. Okay, genetically modified food, and I would say the issue of open source. I think China demand is more progressive. And the company like IBM, Microsoft, they simply want to protect, their proprietary right, to benefit their own shareholder, and that's it. Okay, so I think eventually, we scholars have to be more detached and look at, from more rational and public interest-oriented view to look at those issues. But I think eventually, realistically, it would be a long process of mutual adjustment accommodation, between the United States and China and West world versus China. Yeah.
I'm going to effectively end this session and begin a very, very brief couple of concluding remarks. Just to make sure that I'm following the agenda. I wouldn't allow this to go without a couple of comments. I want to thank everybody for coming in, particularly those of you who've come from out of town, but I'll also thank those of you who joined this group even though you weren't given a free ticket to get here and did so voluntarily. And so I want to thank everybody for their contributions. I came away with an awful lot of things that I learned, but I just wanted to underscore perhaps 2 or 3 quick takeaways that occur to me, and maybe they're not the most profound, but I was just struck by the fact that for all 3 of these countries, the central government, the civil service, the state, seems to be anxious to continue with the intention of shaping the economy, shaping industry, creating the next big thing. But the big question that I think many of you raised is whether it any longer has the capability to do this, whether it's because they no longer control finance, they no longer can control the behavior of companies. I mean, all of these countries now have companies that have much more geographic mobility than their predecessors in the 60s, 70s, or 80s. Countries can move abroad, and so can individuals. So that capacity of the state to shape the economy has, I think, been substantially reduced in all 3, despite the fact that the intentionality may remain very high. And I guess the second big point that I wanted to underscore is just the fact that the economic dilemma that these countries face is substantially different than the one that was faced by their predecessors 30 or 40 years ago. For them, there was a world out there from which they could copy, from which they could buy technology, which had at least a partial roadmap to the economic future. Let's do steel, let's do electronics, let's do shipbuilding. Now these countries are all, and the companies within them are all at the cutting edge of technology, and they have to move from catch-up economics or copycat economics to innovative economics. And a big dilemma that's a subset of this, I think, that several of you pointed out, is that some of the new emerging technologies are simply not going to be amenable to the kinds of strategies that were pursued by the prior developmental state model. That is to say, pumping a lot of government money into a few favored companies, because now the issue is who's going to innovate? Which of these possible 15 IT companies is going to come up with the next equivalent of a Facebook or a Twitter? We don't know that, and so it becomes a puzzle. So the hope, I think, and this is, I guess, drawing heavily on Professor Wang's comment, but it's largely a matter of creating innovation platforms rather than creating national champions or a multitude of national champions. And so that change in the external economic situation, I think, poses a real problem. And I guess the last thing is simply that rise of China and the change in the ideological mix in East Asia. I don't want to go back and reassert the point I made about the importance of the shift from a bipolar security and economic world in which companies in all three of these countries were very heavily dependent on the U.S. market, which for the most part was amenable to their long-term development for ideological, for bipolar, for security reasons. The U.S. wanted all of these countries to develop as substantial economic partners and security allies. That dynamic has changed now with China, which in many respects poses a security challenge and an economic promise. It's not always that clear-cut, but China poses a situation that, as a number of you have said in very different ways, is very different from the combination of the Bretton Woods plus hub-and-spoke alliance structures that the U.S. offered to these countries in their earlier phases. And they're now facing what I think is, in some respects, a kind of short-range national choice. Do we bet on a China that is an economic partner, or do we bet on a China that is a security risk? And of course, as I guess Suzuki-san mentioned just in passing, in many ways this goes back to the classic political science problem, the IR problem of capabilities and intentions. We know what China's capable of. We have no idea what the intentions are. Is there a secret master plan for China to take over the world? Probably not. But certainly there are an awful lot of CCP leaders that would like to see a much more muscular China that somehow gets more respect in areas that they feel have been subject to disrespect in the past. And I guess the last thing I would say, and it reiterates something I said just in passing, but I'm prepared to accept the point that several of you made that China is now so big that nobody can exert tremendous influence on it except perhaps the United States. But collectively, I think a geography around China that's economically dynamic, that is partially committed to open source information on the IT, that's committed to political democracy, that has some vested interest in human rights, et cetera, does provide a challenge to and a check on China that makes for an environment that China has to work with that is less bipolar and confrontational than one in which the U.S. is the only one waving the big bat and trying to beat China into accepting human rights or accepting greater conditions on its on openness of its internet, et cetera, But I'm sure, I hope at least that many of you will go away with points that you've underscored or points that you've learned that I haven't picked up in this last 10 or 15 minutes. I know I'll be going back over my notes over the next couple of days, and I did last night and was highlighting and underscoring and expanding on a lot of others. But it's been very helpful very helpful conference for me, and again, I want to thank everybody for coming in. So
thank you all. Thank you too, Jay.